Welcome you to today's Cattle Over Coffee. I'm Dr. Brandy Carish, your beef cattle extension specialist. Um, we're going to continue on in this series on various cattle topics that we've been doing this summer. This one is one that's kind of near and dear to my heart a little bit. We're going to talk about farm direct beef. So if y'all give me just a second, I will get my slides shared and we will go ahead and get started. As we're going through, feel free to include any questions you might have in the chat box off to the side. I will do my best to address those as we go if they're relevant, or I'll visit with y'all about them there at the end. So today's topic, I think, is one that a lot of producers that are looking to maybe diversify your business a little bit would be certainly very interested in. So direct to consumer beef, farm direct beef, farm to table beef, locally raised beef, a lot of different um, a lot of different words that we can use to describe what we're talking about today. But I think it's important that we kind of take a step back before we start talking about beef that you're producing and raising directly on your farm and look at kind of the big picture. Everything's more expensive in 2026. Beef in the grocery stores is more expensive in 2026. But I think the really neat thing is consumers still like beef. They're still choosing beef. They're still willing to pay for beef. And I think that's something that is pretty interesting as we delve into this topic of locally raised beef and producing beef on your farm, selling to your neighbors, those types of things. So you can see this is data on total US consumption of beef, pork, and chicken in 2026. So you can see beef would be the gray bar in this section, pork would be blue, and chicken would be red. Probably not the most ideal colors. I think beef should be red in this instance. But you can see beef demand and beef consumption has not backed off at all. In fact, we're projecting very similar beef consumption in 2027, even compared to what we were seeing in 2026. So when we start talking about producing beef directly from the farm, I think it's important for a lot of what are typically cow-calf producers to keep what the end goal is in mind. So the end goal in this instance, and actually with every animal that we raise on the farm, is producing a steak that's well marbled, that is something that will keep consumers coming back for more. They want that good beef flavor. They want that good beef eating experience. And when we're talking about farm direct beef, we're layering that extra layer on of kind of knowing where your food comes from and knowing that it was raised locally by someone that you know and trust. So I think this is something that's harder for a lot of cow-calf producers that typically would be selling calves at weaning, and once they're 500-600 pounds, we don't see those calves again. So paying attention to things in terms of your breeding program, and this is the only time I'll talk about animal selection, those types of things. We'll keep it kind of focused on nutrition and growth and kind of the marketing aspect of it. But I think it's important that you have a quality product that you're putting out for consumers. And the steps that we'll talk about later on or things that will go into making that quality product. But as much as you can know about the genetics of, say, the bull that you're using on your cow herd, so if producing beef to sell locally is an end goal, probably need to pay attention to carcass EPDs a little bit more on the bull that you buy. Pay attention to things like marbling, ribeye area, back fat thickness, hot carcass weight, all of those carcass focused traits that with a lot of breeds will incorporate into an index value even, are things that you'll want to pay more attention to on the front side before you produce those calves. So we'll dive in and start talking a little bit about growth and nutrition, and we'll focus specifically on finishing cattle. So we're not really going to focus on that, 5 to 700 pound. We're really focusing on kind of the end point when we're talking about growth and nutrition. And when most people hear finishing cattle, a lot of us in the beef business have this picture in mind. We might think of a feedlot with fence line bunks and all of those cattle lined up to eat. And the reality often looks pretty different for a lot of producers in our part of the world when we're finishing beef locally. So I think if we take a step back and think about how cattle put on protein, which would be muscle, and fat over time, we notice that a lot of the fat deposition happens towards the end of that animal's endpoint, that endpoint in time. And you'll notice that fat deposition kind of plateaus as an animal increases in body weight over time. So a lot of our fat's getting put on at the end, a lot of our marbling's getting put on at the end. So those are times that I think it's really important to pay attention to the energy that we're feeding to those cattle. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later on. But I think it's important to notice that this is not something that's linear when we're talking about fat deposition and protein accretion. Protein accretion, muscle is going to kind of plateau. And fat deposition will increase to a point, and then it's going to kind of plateau as that animal gets bigger and larger as well. So I think it's important when we start talking about understanding growth to understand that a pound of fat and putting on a pound of fat for an animal is going to require more energy. So when we start thinking about more days on feed, more feed, all of those things are going to be required to get an animal that's fat, to get an animal that's finished. Typically, we focus on our grain-based feeds for this, and that's going to be the focus of this presentation. I'm not really going to touch on grass-fed beef or anything along those lines because that's a whole different topic that I think we could spend hours discussing how to finish cattle on grass. A lot of the things that when we're talking about finishing cattle, getting more energy into them is ultimately what's going to produce that finished product. So for most producers, it's a corn grain-based program that's readily available, and corn's cheap right now. So we can add extra corn or extra grain to add energy to increase the fat content in that animal. So we start talking about finishing cattle. When you start visually appraising animals for fat or finish, cattle are going to put on fat from front to back and from top to bottom. So an animal's going to lay in fat in its cod if it's a steer, or if it's udder, if it's a heifer, later on in the finishing period. And if you were to actually put your hands on those animals, you'll notice that fat cover is going to be a lot squishier. So fat feels squishy, muscle feels hard. So fat's going to feel a lot softer as we work our way from the behind that animal's shoulder and kind of work our way down that animal's rib cage. So ideally, there's been a lot of research that's done that animals that are somewhere between 3/10 to a ½ inch of back fat over their 12th and 13th ribs would have a good opportunity to reach the choice grade. So we start talking about quality grades. That would be a combination of marbling, so those little flecks of fat that are in the meat, as well as maturity. So young animals that are well marbled are going to have higher quality grades, and that's typically associated with a better eating experience for ultimately your consumer. So we think about growing and finishing nutrition. The nutrient requirements of cattle are going to vary due to sex, age, weight, their performance that's expected. So if we want them to gain faster and gain more, their nutrient requirements are going to increase, as well as what stage of production they're in. A lot of our finishing programs or our growing programs are based around forage nutrient levels. To get more weight gain on those animals during a finishing period, they're going to require more nutrients. And we'll dive into that a little bit more. When we start talking about growing cattle requirements in terms of energy, we can split that using the net energy system. that was developed to divide requirements for maintenance, growth, and other physiological processes. So for example, we've got a net energy requirement for maintenance of that animal. So that means for the animal to stay status quo as it is right now. For an animal to gain, so a net energy requirement for growth. And then we have net energy requirement for, say, lactation. So if we've got a cow that's in production, she'd have a net energy requirement for lactation. For our purposes here, we're really going to focus on that net energy requirement for growth, or gain. So NEG is what we're going to focus on. And it's going to be dependent on weight. So as that animal gets bigger, it's going to require more energy to maintain itself. And I have to have more energy on top of that to be able to continue to grow. I mentioned this earlier, but average daily gain plays a component, and you'll see it when we split this out into nutrient requirements based on different expected average daily gains. We want them to gain faster, they're going to require more energy. Sex, so bulls versus heifers versus steers. Age, so as an animal is younger versus an animal that's older, as well as maybe periods of compensatory growth. So compensatory growth would be if an animal had been restricted, say for a period of time, and then we'll see an added boost in terms of growth when we finally get them on a good plane of nutrition. So you might think of this in an instant where you may have a drought situation and you wean some calves and they're kind of just on some old dry pasture that's not very good in terms of quality. So they kind of slow down from a growth and a gain standpoint. And then once we get them on a good plane of nutrition, we'll see a big bump in terms of growth for those calves. And that would be in terms of compensatory growth. The key thing I think is down here at the bottom of this slide. Any factor which causes the proportion of fat and gain to increase is going to increase the NEG requirements. So more fat is going to require more energy. So fat is 2.25 times more energy dense than carbohydrates. And it was going to require more energy for the animal to put on fat as compared to muscle. So I mentioned those tables a couple of times, and you can reference these. We've got an extension publication that you can go and look these up, or you can actually download and view online a copy of the nutrient requirements of beef cattle. So this is split out, so mature weight and range. So the animals in this chart would be expected to be about 1,200 pounds at maturity. And you'll see this chart is split into subsections based on expected or anticipated average daily gain at 1, 1.5, and 2 pounds per day. And then we increase in body weight. So you can see kind of what I mentioned a little bit there. So the total amount of daily nutrients required is going to increase as an animal gets bigger. And as we expect that animal to gain more, they're going to require more NEG. So a 400 pound animal that we expect to gain 1 pound per day is only going to need 1 megacal per pound of NEG, versus to gain 2 pounds per day, they'll need 2.2. So that's going to increase. And the daily nutrient requirements would be an absolute number. And then the second, or this right-hand section of the chart, would be daily nutrient requirements as a percentage of their intake. So if we expect those animals to eat more as they get bigger, these would be things like protein required based on what we expect their intake to be. And then NEM and NEG would be in megacals per pound. So we had an absolute requirement for the number of megacals of NEG they needed in terms of total requirements per day here. And then megacals per pound that you can look at here. I usually tell people don't get too bogged down in the absolute numbers. I think it's important to understand how these requirements are going to change over time as we expect these animals to grow and gain more, and we can adjust our feeding strategy kind of based on what those expectations are for those animals. There are a number of free programs out there. Oklahoma State University has some really good ones for growing and finishing cattle. The University of Georgia has some as well that I have used, that if you want to play and kind of fiddle around with changing some feeds and changing some things, that I would recommend that you look to those. But I think keeping it simple is something that we'll talk about and that we'll focus on. I think that's something important. So I mentioned the net energy system. Energy is partitioned into energy for gain, energy for maintenance. So basically, that animal has to meet its net energy requirements for maintenance first. So that's base functions, homeostasis of the body to stay status quo. Anything that's left over from that after they meet their requirements for maintenance can then go to be used for gain. So if we're in an energy limiting situation, it's not very likely that that animal is going to have a whole lot of energy left over to add gain. And in our perspective, what we're concerned with here, to add fat for the animal to be finished ultimately. As cattle get bigger, I mentioned on that previous chart that energy requirement in terms of megacows per day is going to increase as well. So it makes sense, right? As an animal gets bigger, that takes more energy just to maintain themselves as status quo. So more of the energy in the feed is going to go towards maintenance. So anytime we want to increase performance, increase gain, increase fat, all of those things are going to increase the energy needs of those animals. So if you want that animal to gain really fast over a short period of time, you're going to have to increase the energy level in their diet to get more net energy for gain in them. So just to give you an idea of some various kind of commodity feeds or forages that are available and what type of energy content is in each of those. So I've got the NEM, NEG, as well as TDN values listed for all of these feeds. So a lot of cow-calf producers are used to thinking of things in terms of TDN. So TDN stands for total digestible nutrient, and kind of at or above 100 is going to be the best. So for a finishing animal, we'd want to see a TDN of around 85 to 100. So you'll notice a lot of our forages, those types of things are going to be pretty low in terms of an energy content value. So our TDN of corn, for example, would be 94. A TDN of dried distillers grains, DDGS. Dried distillers grains with solubles would be anywhere from 89 to 110. A lot of people like to feed soy hull pellets, corn gluten, like a 2-to-1 or a 3 mix or something along those lines. So you can see what the energy values of those different feeds. So you can see all of those. Kind of corn is our gold standard when we think about comparing things from an energy basis. So you can see corn has really good values from an energy for maintenance, gain, and a TDN standpoint. So lots of options when we start talking about energy, and it can be really easy to get overwhelmed when we start thinking about finishing diets. And we'll talk kind of more about that a little bit later on. I think it's really important that as we focus on grain and as we focus on energy, that we don't forget that cattle are ruminants, right? So fiber is really important in terms of gut health and rumen function. The rumen was designed to break down grass, right? It was designed to break down fiber and turn it into VFAs, volatile fatty acids, that steer, that heifer can then use for energy. So fiber is important to keep a good rumen function, but fiber is typically low energy. So we want to limit fiber to not dilute the energy content, but we want to make sure we keep enough fiber in their diet to maintain rumen health. So most cool and warm season annuals will a lot of times support a gain of about 2.5 to 3 pounds on 5-weight steers. For a lot of producers that I start talking to about setting up kind of a on-farm finishing program, a lot of times that fiber source will come from a free choice hay that would be available to those steers, and not a total mix ration that might have, say, a lot of cottonseed hulls or something like that in it. And I think it's important as well that that fiber source that we're providing for these finishing cattle is enough that it's effective fiber. So not something that's gonna get broken down really quickly in the rumen, but something that's gonna have good scratch factor for those rumen microbes. So I caution when we start talking about rations and we start talking about diets for finishing cattle, more does not mean it's better. I usually encourage the simplest ration is the best for most producers. For small producers that might be doing finishing a handful of steers at a time, anywhere from 2 to 10. Most producers don't need a custom ration when we start talking about finishing small groups. And I encourage you to be aware of, it should say unnecessary ingredients. So just because a ration has 10 ingredients that you can get, doesn't mean it's better than a ration that might have 3 or 4 ingredients. The other thing that I'll caution if you start thinking about custom rations, versus buying something that's already on hand from your local co-op or feed store, especially this time of year, is you need to consider freshness of the feed. It is 96 degrees and it feels like 500% humidity outside right now, but the air is thick and it's hot. Feed will go bad quickly. So making sure that that feed stays fresh and does not get moldy in the time that it takes us to feed those animals, I think it's an important consideration when you start talking about finishing cattle. Moldy feed is not good for gut health and keeping cattle healthy. As a general rule of thumb, cattle will eat about 2 to 2.5% of their body weight. So we can use that when we start estimating how much feed we'll need for a finishing program. So if you have steers or you have cattle that are on a feed for about 90 days, and when I say on feed, I mean really getting all they want of a grain-based ration in this instance, they'll eat typically on average about 20 pounds per head per day of this quote unquote finishing ration. So 90 days at 20 pounds per head per day is almost a ton of feed for that animal to get it finished. There's a lot of questions of how long do I have to keep them on feed to get them finished? And a lot of that's going to depend on how big the cattle are when you start them on feed, and how energy dense your finishing ration is, and what your target weight is, your target goal. When we talk about feedlots right now in the US, a lot of feedlots are averaging 1,700 pound finishing weights. Most on-farm finished cattle are not going to be that big. I would encourage you to plan on getting them to about 13 to 1,400 pounds, kind of dependent on your genetics. And that'll be specific, obviously, to your operation. But we're not seeing many cattle that are fat and finished with the genetics that we have in the US these days at less than 11 to 1,200 pounds. Most of them probably need to be a good 1,300 pounds before they're really good and finished. So that might take longer than 90 days. So take that into consideration when you start thinking about feed and how much feed you'll need for those animals as you have them in that finishing period. So when we talk about feeding cattle in Mississippi, there's not a traditional feedlot system set up that we see in a lot of Western states or in the Midwest, where you have those fence line bunks and, you know, thousands of head on feed, and you've got a feed truck and you've got a feed mill, so where you're mixing feed on site, and feed storage. All of those things are limiting when we're talking about feeding and finishing cattle at home. Bunk management, a lot of times we'll see big feedlots feeding those cattle 3 times a day. Most of us have jobs off of the farm, so that's not something that is available for us to do. I will say I do encourage, if you have the ability to feed cattle that you're finishing twice a day, feed them in the morning first thing and feed them in the evening. That's typically going to be the best from a feed intake and a gain standpoint. So, one of the things that I think is pretty cool about my job is that I get to take questions that we get from producers like y'all and do research to answer those questions. So a lot of y'all are aware that in 2020, when we had the world shut down, a lot of our processing grocery store infrastructure set down, and everybody that had cattle had neighbors asking them about, can I get beef from you? How do I get beef? So what we wanted to do was look at, we called it non-traditional finishing system, a simple limit fed system, and see how it compared to a more traditional finishing diet, and look at it from a performance, carcass quality, and we also looked at economics. So this study was done on the research station in Poplarville, so down on the Gulf Coast. So that's a pretty non-traditional microclimate in terms of beef cattle finishing systems. So it's not located close to a big hotbed where a lot of grain is produced. It's hot, it's humid, it's hot and humid at Starkville right now. It's even more hot and humid down in Poplarville today. We get a lot of rain, there's a lot of moisture, mud, all of those things would be some limitations there. So what did we do? We looked at finishing cattle in small groups over a 2-year period in the summer. So we did just 12 head individually fed in year 1, and we doubled that in year 2 and fed 24 head. These were kind of backgrounded yearlings, if you want to think of them that way. So some steers that we kind of kicked out on grass and grown to about 850 pounds at the start of this finishing period. And then they were on feed anywhere from 130 to 190 days. And they were in grass traps and fed individually. So these small pasture grass traps would be similar to what I would recommend for a lot of producers in Mississippi. So finishing them on supplementing them in a pasture-based system with grain. We killed them either at the meat lab on campus, and then in year 2, we did a more local facility there in Poplarville. We fed them what we called a traditional diet that was designed to maximize intake. So we let them eat as much as they want, like we would traditionally see in a feedlot system. So we started them at 1.5% of their body weight and increased that as their consumption increased. The other 2 diets were limit fed. So those cattle weren't allowed to get over 1.9% of their body weight. And every time we got any body weight on them, we adjusted how much we fed them. Depending on the year, we slaughtered them in 2 to 3 groups. So most of our small processing facilities can't handle, hundreds of head in a day. And then we collected carcass measurements 48 hours post-mortem. So this is kind of an idea to give y'all of what the finished cattle look like in these 2 experiments. So you can see both of those cattle. One of the places that I usually tell producers to evaluate fat or finish is in that brisket area. So you can see both the briskets on these 2 steers are getting pretty full. We're notice kind of some fat bones building up kind of around their tail heads. So these cattle are getting kind of that glossy, shiny look. If your body condition scoring them, they're getting up, close to a 7. So that's what we'd want to see when we evaluate those cattle, to know that they're getting close to being finished. So these are what our 3 diets looked like. That complete diet was a cottonseed hull based with some corn and some other grains in it. We had one that was a soybean hull based diet, and then one that was a cracked corn based diet. So what did they look like? The cracked corn, or the traditional diet, had 51% cracked corn. It had some soybean hulls. The mixing pellet would be kind of a high protein pellet that was designed to get an added protein boost in these diets. We actually used gin motes. I said cottonseed hulls on the previous slide. We used gin motes in there. So that would be commodity feed that a lot of producers have ready access to, but you could also kind of think of that like cottonseed hulls if you're not familiar with it. And then we included a mineral mixed in there as well. We wanted to keep those non-traditional diets as simple as possible. So they were either corn or soybean hulls in our mix and pellet. So our mix and pellet on these was at a little higher percent, and then we were either 60% corn or 60% soy hulls with a little bit more mineral in those. We varied a little bit from year to year. In year one, we had a lot more labor basically on the research station, and they mixed the diet on site. In year two, we outsourced it. And we had it mixed at Kentwood Co-op, which would be not too far from the research station there in Poplarville. So I do caution whenever we start talking about mixing feed on farm, as particularly when we're mixing in micro ingredients like your mineral packs, those types of things. Most of our on-farm kind of hand mixing, we don't get it consistently mixed in like you would at, say, a traditional feed mill. So you don't get as good of a blend. So basically you don't have mineral in every bite of that feed, if you kind of want to think of it that way. So this was the nutrient analysis of those diets. You can see we were up from about 9 to 15% protein in year one. Our NEG was about 1.25 down to 1.1 megacalories per kilogram in year one. And then in year two, we were about 10% to 12% protein, and our NEG was a little bit higher kind of by design in year two. Or our NEG was similar in year two. Sorry, I'm just looking at the wrong. So one thing that I have not mentioned, oops, go back a couple of slides. The larger cattle get, the less percent protein we typically would require in their diets. So finishing cattle only need about 9 to 10% protein in their diet if we're offering them all they can eat. As we start limit feeding those cattle, if you're only giving them 1% or 1.5% of their body weight, you'd want that feed to be more nutrient dense. So you'd want to see a little bit higher crude protein in their diets. So what did we see? Probably not surprisingly, we saw greater gains in the traditional diet, but they weren't that different. So our corn-based treatment was 1.85 pounds per day, and our traditional diet was 2.1 pounds per day. By design, we consumed less feed on our limit-fed diets as compared to our traditional diet. Cattle were a little bit bigger on the traditional diet as compared to our limit-fed diet. And with that, we also we saw similar ending body weights, similar hot carcass weights, or greater hot carcass weight, sorry, for the diet group. The dressing percent was greater for the diet group and the corn group compared to soybean hulls. Both of those are right around 60%, which is what I would expect as a general rule of thumb for cattle that are processed in kind of smaller plants. Typically, like large scale processing facilities might be up 62 to 63%. I usually tell producers expect 60% or a little bit lower dressing percent. Our cattle on the diet group were fatter, so they had higher numerical yield rates as compared to our limit-fed soy hull groups. But the rest of our carcass traits weren't different. So our marbling was similar and our ribeye areas were similar amongst our treatment groups. So what we really saw a big difference in was cost. So those cattle ate less feed on our limit-fed treatment groups. You'll notice year one was in 2020, year two was in 2023. Feed costs almost tripled going from year one to year two. So we had a few years in between those. So cost per animal for the diet group was 302 compared to 845. And we had considerably less cost in our limit fed groups, the corn and the soy hull groups. So our results, we saw those simpler limit fed diets were a viable option to finish cattle with similar carcass quality and lower input costs compared to that TMR, that total mixed ration. So when we start talking about nutrition, simple is often best. Something that you can manage and that you can consistently provide to those cattle would be what I would recommend for most producers. If you have the ability to pull a feed sample and send it off, particularly if you're feeding commodity-based feeds, that's going to be key to kind of know where your cattle are. So sampling those diets and ensuring your mix is matching your formulation, because those byproducts can be variable, and make sure we're offering enough roughage to those cattle. So we talked a little bit about feeding the cattle, and I'll talk a little bit about kind of the end side of things, just a little bit. So there are federally regulated meat processing guidelines that we have to stick to depending on how you want to sell those animals. If the meats to be sold in cross state lines or sold in foreign commerce, it has to be federally inspected, and you've got a little bit more federal flexibility there. It can be state inspected if it's only sold in state, and then you also have custom processors are an option as well. So those would be the ones that you took them to a processor and your meat comes back labeled as not for sale. So only the person that owned that animal can consume that meat. So there's some differences in terms of inspectors that are present on site, those types of things. Any meat and poultry in the state of Mississippi that's produced for resale into commerce must bear the mark of inspection. So finding a processor can be pretty difficult, and knowing what level of inspection they offer, I think is something that's important, and visiting with your processor beforehand to see if they fit what your goals are from a marketing standpoint. So the Department of Ag in Mississippi has this website. So it's a meat establishment map. So I took a screenshot of it here. So basically it's got all of the meat processors that are available in the state of Mississippi. So you'll notice some of these would be deer processors that would be listed on here. So the second one that's shown down here at the bottom is a processing only custom deer processor located in Macomb. The one at the top is a slaughter and a processing facility. They're federally inspected, and they'll kill beef, sheep, goat, and pork. And it's got their address and their contact information there as well. So if you are looking for a processor, I encourage you to visit that website and find one that's local to you, that will fit the needs and the goals of what you're trying to get out of this farm direct beef. So I mentioned a little bit, there's a lot of questions and there's a lot of confusion about selling meat. All meat and meat products sold to consumers must be from animals that have been slaughtered, processed, and labeled in an approved facility and have passed antemortem and postmortem inspections. So that means to resell that product, so it doesn't have just a not for sale label, it has to be produced in an inspected facility. You can also sell your product at retail. So for example, a lot of our local co-ops have the option to have a meat case, or they'll sell local products or displays in there. If your product has been inspected at a facility and it's labeled, you can sell your product at retail. Farmers markets require a mobile retail food establishment license from the Department of Ag and Commerce. I think it's $10 per year to get that permit to be able to sell at your local farmers market. Back probably 5-10 years ago, I'm not sure exactly, I think it was 2019, maybe when the requirements changed. It used to be that to sell those products at a farmer's market, you have to keep them in a refrigerated truck, basically, and they've lifted a lot of those requirements, but we are still required to keep records. So the Department of Ag has a FAQ for beef farm to table, and that's where I pulled these from. So it's a good, several good resources on the Mississippi Department of Ag website. The next thing that's probably the hardest after finding a processor is trying to figure out how to manage customer expectations. I found that the your local consumer probably isn't, and a lot of producers honestly are not very knowledgeable about how much meat and what kind of different cuts and those types of things that they can expect if they buy half beef or a whole beef, and what the different options are. A lot of your processing facilities will do a nice job of walking that consumer or that customer through the different cut options. And a lot of them will offer things like, say, a flat iron steak or a Denver steak, or chunk steaks, those types of things that might not be a traditional offering. One of the things that I find confuses a lot of consumers is they'll want to get both T-bones and strips and fillets. Well, the strip and fillet are basically a part of the T-bone. So if you get a T-bone, you can't then split that steak out into strips and fillets. So this graphic actually comes from a publication that we put together, I think back in 2020, on how much meat to expect from a beef animal. So I've got that linked here at the end. The other thing that I think causes a lot of confusion for a lot of consumers is they think I bought a 1,200-pound steer, and they kind of understand hot carcass weight, and they think that should be take-home beef. So I get a lot of, oh, the processor must have stole my meat because I didn't get as much as what I expected. So we've got a section in that publication that kind of breaks down every point where we lose weight during the process. So first step, that 1,200-pound live animal becomes a hot carcass weight. In this example, I've got a dressing percent of 63%. But obviously that will adjust kind of based on your processor, based on the animal. There's a lot of things that can affect hot carcass weight that we get into a little bit more in that publication. So we go from 1,200 to 756 pounds. Chilling, we're going to lose some water weight, so you can expect about a 4% cooler shrink. So that 756-pound hot carcass weight becomes 726 pounds. That we lost to just shrink from a moisture standpoint. Depending on their cuts, how much boneless cuts, how much ground meat, those types of things, we can expect about 30 to 40% of that to be lost as fat trim, bone, those types of things. So that puts you about 470 pounds of take-home beef for a whole beef. For that 1,200-pound steer, if that customer only bought a half, that'd be about 235 pounds of take-home beef from that half of beef. So I think it's important to manage those customer expectations on the front end. So they don't show up to pick up their beef and expect that they're going to get 700 pounds of beef when it's going to end up being 470 pounds. A general rule of thumb is that you're going to get about 40% of that animal's live weight as take-home beef, or 75% of the hot carcass weight. So again, these are estimates. So depending on how you choose that cut, that fabrication, the age of the animal, the type of the animal, those types of things, all of those are going to affect take-home beef weight. The other question that I still struggle to wrap my head around, because I always underestimate how much freezer space you need, is how much freezer space do you need for whole beef, half beef, quarter beef, and so on. Typically so this is broken down into quarter, half, whole beef, and it's got a chest freezer versus shelves and a stand-up freezer. So we'll just focus on a half beef. So about 10 cubic feet. So about 8 to 10 cubic feet is the general recommendation for a chest freezer for a half a beef. If you've got a stand-up freezer, that half a beef should take up about 4 shelves in a stand-up freezer. It's not fitting in a fridge freezer combo. So this is a good graphic that breaks that down a little bit more. So in general, you can expect about 1 cubic foot of freezer space for every 25 to 35 pounds of meat. So obviously, every package is going to be a little bit different, right? So brisket, for example, might be one that might be a little bit more cumbersome, I guess. So brisket's big, it's kind of unwieldy, it's not going to fit as neatly into a space as, say, some flat packaged ground beef. So typically 8 to 10 cubic feet for a half beef. I could not get this video to embed on here for the sake of time, since we're about 10 till noon. I'm not going to play it for you. But this is a video from the meat lab here on campus. Hunter Goodson is our meat lab manager, and the last time they had custom beef, he actually did a nice video where he broke down and showed you this is how many steaks you're getting from a half a beef roast, so on. So I think it's something that was a really nice visual. So if you visit MAFIS Meat Science and Muscle Biology Lab, you can view that video there. So I've got some useful resources here, that publication on how much meat to expect. We've got several other resources on the beef extension page, niche processing, Department of Ag, Department of Health. Those types of resources I think are good so that you're aware and you're comfortable with what your goals are and how they fit in terms of regulations. So we're selling food, right? So there's food is has a lot more regulations than just selling a cow. So that's some considerations there as well. And I am happy to share these slides after the fact if anybody is interested in those, to kind of get direct to those links. This is my contact information. If you have specific questions for me as well, I'll be glad to share those. Feel free to take a picture or screenshot, and I'll be happy to go back to that last one if anybody wants to get a screenshot of those. And with that, I have 11:50 on the dot. So I did not see any questions pop up in the chat. But feel free to unmute if you've got any questions or anything you'd like to ask.
Brandy, have y'all done any research on 14 versus 21 day hang time?
I have not. We have not done any here that I'm aware of. So that'd be kind of more on the meat science side of things. I'll have to check into that because I am sure someone at some point in time. So basically, so John's question, a lot of processors will hang for 14 days. Some of them will hang for 21 days to dry age those carcasses. So the longer that we dry age them, the more tender that we can expect that meat to be. But we also kind of have to balance it from a cooler space and then a moisture loss standpoint. So as we shrink, so Kit made the comment that shrink was going to reduce total pounds. And yes, so as we age it longer, we're losing more moisture from that carcass. So it's going to be more tender, but you're going to have the trade-off that you're going to have less pounds of beef from a 14-day versus a 21-day age. And a lot of it depends on cooler space too with those processors, because that's a limitation for a lot of them as well.
The test y'all did, you talked about earlier, did y'all hang them for 14 or 21 days?
So we took all of our measurements at 48 hours post-mortem. So we didn't follow them all the way through the finished or the post-aging side of things. So on both of those, we looked at 48 hours. We ribbed the carcasses into quality grades, yield grades, ribeye areas, marbling, fat thickness on all of those carcasses. So that was just at 48 hours postmortem. We didn't do any tenderness work, and we didn't measure total take home cuts or total take home weight on those carcasses. So actually for year 2, we sold those directly to that facility and they marketed them. So. Good questions. Anybody else? John, I feel like you could probably write a book from your experiences from what y'all have done from a finished beef standpoint.
Yeah, one thing we are struggling with here lately has been the I guess the take home, the end. We're not seeing 60%, where we're in the low 50s,
Sure,
and that's becoming of a concern, and we don't exactly know what our problem is and stuff. We talk to the processor and they say you got good fat coverage. I know you're gonna lose more trimming has to come off before they can process the beef at 21 days and 14. Um, that's one area that we seem to be hurting at. And naturally that makes a big difference
sure.
in the return on the cow.
Yeah, so one of the things from the smaller processors, there's some inefficiencies in a smaller processing facility. So for example, when we went from the meat lab at Blue Hall that was built in what the 50s or 60s over to our new meat lab here, one of the things that we used to lose a lot from a dressing percentage standpoint because we didn't have a hide puller. So they would lay them in a cradle and have to by hand trim those hides off of those animals. So you, depending on how good and the person that was doing that with the knife, you'd lose some fat and you'd lose some things that from an inefficiency standpoint that you might not have lost. And then the other thing too, I think in terms of take home weight and the consideration is how much you're grinding. So as you grind more, I feel like you're going to lose a little bit more from, obviously you're not going to have that bone in weights and those types of things. So as you grind and as you further process things, I expect that 40% of that total weight to decrease.
Brandy,
Mhm.
of your 40% of total weight, does that include like, I have some customers that want the tongue, the liver, the tail, the bone marrow and all that stuff, and then some that don't. Is that 40% going to include those kind of weird off-haul products or not?
No, it doesn't include those. So obviously you can keep broth bones, soup bones, tongue, oxtail, heart, liver, a lot of things that a lot of customers might not eat. But I feel like we're seeing a lot more people that are interested in those types of things. So like keeping all your fat trim to make tallow, those types of things. That will all kind of add, that would have been waste in the past is getting repurposed and used for other things. Any more? I forgot to launch the poll. I did such a good job launching the poll for everybody else that I forgot to launch the poll. So if y'all wouldn't mind, there is a poll end of survey that we use to just kind of accumulate some data. I know there's several extension agents on here, so make sure that y'all answer the poll and get through to the last question so we can count it for in-service credit. So if y'all take a minute, it should be visible for you now. Does anybody have any other questions? There's been a couple of good ones so far. One thing I will comment just kind of from experience. So what I have seen is a lot of producers, if you're typically have been on the cow-calf side of things and you're used to selling your calves at weaning or maybe after a yearling or a backgrounding period, it's scary to jump off into finishing beef and that side of things. So one of the things that our family did is we took, I called them the rejects. the ones that kind of didn't fit the group, or if we knew if we took them to the sale barn would get knocked from a color standpoint or a size standpoint or some of those types of things, and take those and finish those cattle. And that was kind of a good introduction to finishing beef on farm for our family. So that's one thing that if you're jumping off into it, I would say put a couple head on feed for yourself. What I usually encourage most producers is find a good base feed that you know you can get consistently and can get fresh, and add corn to it. So your goal, so y'all saw on that research project that we did, we were up about 50 to 60% corn in the diet. So your goal on those finishing cattle, as you increase the corn, we're increasing the energy. So if you're doing that, I would recommend bumping the corn up in their ration to about 50% corn. And the other, your base feed, which a lot of times will have corn in it as well. So simple is often better, is usually what I tell folks. And the nice thing is there's not just one single way to feed a steer. So everybody that we'll talk to probably has something they do that's just a little bit different, because you got to figure out from an economic standpoint and those types of things, what's going to work best for you. Any other questions?
Hey, Brandy.
Hmm?
One thing that was way back earlier in the beginning, where you were talking about finished weights, that you start at this weight, finish weight, whatever. Also keep in mind frame size, you know.
Yep.
I primarily feed small frame, cheaper cattle. So I'm finishing out 1,000 pretty handily. But that makes a difference, and that's gonna make a difference in your feed cost and your yield and what you're basically selling to the consumer.
Sure, that's a good point. So large frame, kind of dependent on breed type, those types of things, are gonna be ones that need to be finished at a bigger weight. If you've got some smaller frame ones, you can maybe get them fat, at a smaller weight, but I think making sure you're paying attention. The other thing is a lot of the processors are gonna be booked up months out. So planning ahead and getting on the books for a kill date. It's not something that you can say, hey, I've got a steer that's finished. I need to take him in next week. It's usually booking anywhere from 3 to 4 to 6 or 12 months out, depending on the facility and kind of what they offer and those types of things.
Good job. Thanks, Brandy.
Okay. Thanks,
Yes,
Kip.
done a very good job.
Okay, thanks, John. All right, if anybody else, last call for questions.
I do have a question, and
Mhm.
I don't know if you really mentioned it. The question on grass finish. I know you mentioned a lot about feed. Did y'all do any studying for grass finishing them or that process?
We have not done any grass finished beef here on campus. I will say a lot of the same nutrient considerations would still apply to grass fed beef. The biggest thing I think is that you're going to have to be prepared. You're probably not finishing them on Bermuda grass pasture, right? You're going to have to finish them typically on like some annuals, something that's higher quality, maybe like a ryegrass, a wheat, maybe add some clover, thinking about what your forage mix would be, to get those cattle fat on grass. And I think grass finished beef really depends a lot on genetics too. There's some breeds of cattle that are predisposed to finish better on grass. And I think particularly selecting for those with a good quality carcass genetics. So carcass traits, like focusing a lot on high genetics for marbling, those types of things, I think really come into play when you're talking about finishing cattle on grass. So typically, Kip had mentioned those smaller framed, earlier maturing ones. Those would be the ones that typically I would expect to be better from a grass finish standpoint.
All right, thank you, Brandon.
You're welcome.
I guess this is more of a comment than it is a question. Don't sell your stuff too cheap.
Sure.
That's the hardest part about dealing is people will lower their price because they get nervous about something. Just our beef has a value and they will pay for that value if you ask for that value.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point that John brings up. I think one of the things that a lot of producers struggle with is pricing your beef. And it's easy to look up and say, what are fats you're selling for on the commodity market, and try to price it at that. But I think the beef that you're producing on your farm is not equivalent to the beef that's finished on what I'll call the commodity market. You know, the costs are when you're spreading out the costs among the thousands, hundreds of thousands of head that might be fed in a single feedlot compared to spreading out costs among, 5 to 10 head. Your costs are going to be very different there as well. And then I think it's important to remember that you're producing a premium product, right? So you're not producing a commodity product. So finding, and I think paying attention to your local market. So look and follow some groups and see what other producers in your area are selling beef for. And I usually encourage people to kind of base it around that because I think John's comment is important. If you undersell basically everybody else, you're kind of doing yourself and them a disservice. So I think knowing your costs is something that's really crucial when you're thinking about pricing these. And let's be honest, if you just sent that calf to the sale barn, he's worth a whole lot in this cattle market right now. So I think the value of that calf at the beginning of the feeding period, especially in today's cattle market, is something that needs to be factored in as you're pricing beef.
The ones that want to compare your beef cost to the Walmart or Sam's or whatever, you have to explain to them the differences. You know, like John said, it's quality product. You need to price it accordingly. And you need to price it where you're making a profit because we aren't doing all this for fun.
It's a lot of work, that's for sure. All right, well, I will go ahead and end us here. Thanks everybody who participated in the poll. Thank y'all for sticking around. I'll also have the recording up, depending on how long it takes to get processed, either later this afternoon or first thing tomorrow. So the link to those recordings to that playlist was included in the email that you got this morning as well. And then it's also shared on various other sources. So thanks everybody for joining me today. Just in time for you to go grab some lunch. So bye.
All right.